You think death was the scariest part? No. The real terror came before the grave. In 1347, your skin could blacken, split, and fall from your bones, while you were still alive to feel it happen. The Black Death didn't just kill. It mutilated, humiliated, and turned human bodies into leaking sacks of decay. Blood poured from eyes, pus bubbled from groins, and the stench of rotting flesh blanketed entire cities. But that wasn't the worst of it. These weren't just random outbreaks. They toppled empires, rewrote economies, and turned religious devotion into apocalyptic hysteria. Entire villages vanished. Bodies piled so high in city streets, there weren't enough prayers left to bury them. And yet, the worst of it wasn't the death. It was how much people suffered to get there. But that was only the beginning of what history tried to forget, and science still can't fully explain. This is the most horrific diseases in history. Let's begin. The sweating sickness could kill you in under 24 hours by making you literally sweat to death. We're talking buckets of perspiration until your body just gave up. Not metaphorical sweating, but actual puddles of sweat soaking through beds, clothes, and eventually your will to live. This mysterious killer had a peculiar taste in victims. While most medieval diseases preyed on the poor and weak, the sweating sickness was basically a royal stalker. It hit Tudor England 5 times between 1485 and 1551, specifically targeting the wealthy and healthy, while largely ignoring those who couldn't afford the luxury of dying fashionably. The symptoms were as dramatic as they were horrifying. First came sudden chills, headaches, and body aches. Pretty standard plague stuff. But then the sweating started. Not your average, just ran a marathon perspiration, but an endless flood that would soak through mattresses. Victims would be drenched within minutes, their bodies literally drowning themselves from the inside out. Henry VIII, not exactly known for running from his problems, scattered his court like startled pigeons every time the disease appeared. Nothing says divine right to rule quite like abandoning your palace because you're afraid of your own bodily fluids. The king would frantically move from place to place, trying to outrun an enemy he couldn't see or behead. The truly bizarre part? You could wake up feeling fine, start sweating by lunch, and be dead before dinner. The disease moved so fast that doctors, already working with the medieval equivalent of WebMD, had barely time to document symptoms before their patients expired. Their sophisticated medical advice: stay moderately warm, don't move around too much, and try not to die. Because apparently, just don't sweat was considered viable medical guidance in Tudor England. Then, as mysteriously as it appeared, the sweating sickness vanished. After its final outbreak in 1551, it never returned, leaving historians with nothing but terrified chronicles and some very damp records. Modern theories suggest it might have been a hantavirus, but that's just educated guessing. The disease was courteous enough to disappear before anyone could properly identify it. The real kicker? This was just the opening act of medieval England's disease problems. Because apparently one mysterious killer that made you sweat to death wasn't enough excitement for 1 century. Ergotism turned bread, literally humanity's most basic food, into a hallucinogenic death trap that made entire villages dance themselves into graves. Let that sink in. Medieval people's daily bread was occasionally laced with natural LSD that could either kill you or make you think you were being chased by dragons. The culprit was ergot fungus, a nasty little parasite that loves growing on rye in damp conditions. When consumed, it produces compounds chemically similar to LSD, except medieval bakers weren't exactly advertising psychedelic sourdough as their specialty. The fungus contains ergotamine, which can cause both horrific hallucinations and deadly gangrene, because apparently picking just one way to torture humans wasn't enough. The 1518 Strasbourg outbreak is probably the most infamous example. Over 400 people suddenly started dancing uncontrollably in the streets, many until they literally dropped dead from exhaustion, heart attacks, and strokes. local authorities demonstrating the kind of problem-solving skills you'd expect from people who thought witch-burning was reasonable, actually hired musicians to play for the dancers. Because obviously what people dancing themselves to death really need is better background music. But medieval Europe didn't have a monopoly on bread-induced madness. In 1951, the French town of Pont-Saint-Esprit gave us a modern glimpse of what our ancestors endured. Hundreds of people suddenly started experiencing vivid hallucinations. Some thought they were sprouting wings. Others reported being chased by tigers through the streets of rural France. One man was convinced his head had turned to brass. The local hospital looked like a scene from a surrealist painting come to life. The truly terrifying part? Ergot poisoning was so common in medieval Europe that it had multiple nicknames. St. Anthony's fire was the popular one, named for the burning sensation victims felt before their limbs started turning black and falling off. Yes, you read that correctly. This fungus could either make you trip so hard you dance to death, or cause your extremities to develop gangrene and decompose while you were still alive. Talk about a bad batch of sourdough. What's particularly wild is that this wasn't some rare occurrence. Ergot poisoning was a regular feature of medieval life. During wet growing seasons, up to 40% of rye crops could be contaminated. Imagine playing Russian roulette with your breakfast every morning, never knowing if today's bread would be regular old bread or a one-way ticket to Hallucination Town. The real kicker? Some historians think ergot might explain more than just dancing plagues. There are theories that the Salem witch trials, among other historical mass hysterias, might have been triggered by ergot-contaminated grain. Because of course, one of humanity's first agricultural achievements was accidentally creating a bread-based hallucinogen that could either kill you or make you accuse your neighbors of witchcraft. At least when medieval people weren't busy tripping on toxic bread, they found other creative ways to make life interesting, like burying people alive for having bad skin. Medieval people were so terrified of leprosy they'd declare you legally dead and bury you alive in elaborate funeral ceremonies, while you watched your own burial. And this wasn't some rare occurrence. It was literally written into law across Europe. The process was as twisted as it sounds. When someone was diagnosed with leprosy, they'd be forced to attend their own funeral mass. The priest would read the burial rites while the deceased stood there, very much alive, watching dirt being thrown on an empty coffin. Because apparently, regular funerals weren't traumatic enough. Here's the kicker. Actual leprosy is barely contagious. You're more likely to catch tuberculosis from someone on a bus than leprosy from sharing a house with a patient. The bacteria is so bad at spreading that 95% of humans have a natural immunity to it. But medieval doctors weren't exactly running clinical trials. Archaeological evidence from leper colonies like Næstved in Denmark reveals something even more disturbing. Many lepers weren't lepers at all. They were people with psoriasis, eczema, or even severe acne. Imagine being declared legally dead because you had a bad skin day. Once declared a leper, you lost everything: property, marriage rights, even your humanity. Medieval law codes explicitly stated that lepers had ceased to exist, despite their inconvenient habit of continuing to breathe. They were forced to wear special clothing, carry clappers to warn others of their approach, and were forbidden from touching anything in public markets. The leper colonies themselves were a special kind of nightmare. Called lazarettos after Lazarus, these institutions were part prison, part hospice, and part social experiment in enforced isolation. Some were actually well-funded, with their own churches and farms, because nothing says Christian charity like building a nice prison for people you've declared undead. What's particularly wild is how long this practice continued. We're not just talking about the everything is witchcraft medieval period. Legal death for lepers was still happening in parts of Europe well into the 17th century. People were being buried alive by law while Newton was working out calculus. The real tragedy: most skin conditions that got you exiled weren't actually leprosy. The disease does cause nerve damage and skin lesions. But those dramatic descriptions of limbs falling off, that's what happens when you can't feel injuries and they go untreated. Medieval medicine managed to take a manageable bacterial infection and turn it into a zombie apocalypse scenario. Speaking of apocalyptic scenarios, at least the Byzantines had a slightly more rational response when actual plagues showed up. They just stuffed corpses into tower blocks and invented social distancing about 1,400 years early. The plague of Justinian killed 25 million people, half the Byzantine Empire, and made survivors so paranoid they accidentally invented social distancing 1,400 years early. When the bubonic plague hit Constantinople in 541 CE, it hit like a biblical apocalypse. Bodies piled up so fast the city ran out of burial space and started stuffing corpses into fortress towers like some macabre game of architectural Tetris. And that was just the beginning. Emperor Justinian, who caught the plague but survived, basically invented pandemic response protocols. He banned public gatherings, closed theaters, and ordered people to stay home, proving that humans have always hated lockdowns, regardless of century. The death toll was so extreme that contemporary historian Evagrius wrote about bodies being heaped up like bundles of hay. When a Byzantine historian starts using farming metaphors to describe corpse management, you know things have gotten out of hand. Archaeological excavations at Leuc Acte revealed mass graves containing over 1,500 skeletons from this single outbreak. The graves were so hastily dug that bodies were just dumped in at any angle. Apparently, proper burial positioning becomes optional when you're dealing with plague math. The economic impact was like someone hit the empire's reset button. Trade collapsed, taxes couldn't be collected, and entire industries just stopped. Fields went unplowed, shops closed, and the sophisticated Byzantine economy essentially curled up in a corner and whimpered. The plague kept coming back in waves for about 2 centuries, because one apocalypse is never enough. Each new outbreak would trigger the same cycle: mass death, economic collapse, failed recovery attempts. Repeat. It's like watching an empire play a particularly brutal game of 2 steps forward, 12 steps back. The most darkly ironic part: the Byzantines' desperate attempts at disease control, quarantines, travel restrictions, and yes, social distancing, actually worked better than most medieval responses to plagues. They just didn't have enough living people left to maintain an empire. The plague of Justinian finally proved what every civilization learns eventually. Nature doesn't care about your imperial ambitions. You can build the most sophisticated society on Earth, but one bad batch of plague-carrying rats will still ruin your millennium. At least the Byzantines got to die on land. When scurvy started terrorizing sailors a few centuries later, it turned maritime exploration into a floating horror show where your old wounds would randomly reopen and your teeth would fall out mid-voyage. Scurvy turned sailors into walking corpses whose old wounds would spontaneously reopen while their teeth turned black and fell out. Because vitamin C deficiency is apparently very committed to the horror aesthetic. Think your healing factor's reliable? Scurvy says, hold my citrus. Without vitamin C, your body literally starts unraveling at the molecular level, reversing years of healing like some nautical time machine of suffering. That scar from your childhood? Surprise, it's back and bleeding. The symptoms read like a horror movie checklist. First, your gums turn spongy and black. Then, your teeth decide they'd rather abandon ship than stick around. But that's just the appetizer. The main course is when your body basically forgets how to hold itself together. Magellan's 1519 voyage shows just how bad it could get. Out of 250 crew members, 208 died, most from scurvy. Survivors described watching their shipmates' leg wounds reopen until you could see the bone. Because apparently regular decomposition wasn't dramatic enough, scurvy decided to add reverse healing to its repertoire. The really maddening part? The cure was literally growing on trees. Fresh fruits and vegetables prevent scurvy entirely, But good luck convincing naval authorities that sailors needed more than just salted meat and hardtack. Ships would sail past islands full of citrus fruits while their crews literally fell apart. James Lind finally proved citrus prevented scurvy in 1747 through experiments aboard HMS Salisbury. It was the first controlled medical trial in history, and it worked perfectly. So naturally, the Royal Navy took another 40 years to make limes mandatory on ships, because when you're choosing between preventing sailor zombification and maintaining bureaucratic procedure, obviously paperwork comes first. The British finally got their act together in the 1790s and started stocking ships with citrus fruit. This actually gave them a major advantage in the Napoleonic Wars. Turns out it's easier to win naval battles when your sailors aren't dissolving mid-fight. Though the term limey probably wasn't meant as a compliment. But hey, at least sailors chose to go to sea knowing the risks. Back on land, people were about to discover that something as innocent as dancing could turn just as deadly as any ocean voyage. And this time, they wouldn't even have the comfort of knowing why their bodies were betraying them. In 1518, Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophea started dancing in the street and couldn't stop. Within a week, 34 others joined her, and within a month, over 400 people were dancing themselves to death. This wasn't your typical medieval flash mob. These people were literally unable to stop moving, dancing day and night until they collapsed from exhaustion, heart failure, or strokes. Picture a crowd of people dancing with bloody feet, foaming at the mouth, and begging for help while their bodies refused to obey them. The city's response was special. Local authorities, in their infinite wisdom, decided the best treatment for uncontrollable dancing was more dancing. They built a wooden stage in the town square and hired musicians, because apparently what this medical emergency really needed was better choreography and a soundtrack. Contemporary records describe victims dancing hot and wild. Some reportedly begged priests to splash them with holy water, while others screamed that they were being attacked by invisible forces. Many danced until their feet were raw meat, then kept going until they literally dropped dead in the street. The outbreak lasted for months, with new victims joining the macabre dance party almost daily. The death toll mounted as exhausted dancers succumbed to heart attacks, dehydration, and injuries. Medieval doctors, demonstrating their usual medical brilliance, blamed it on hot blood and prescribed bleeding, because clearly what these people needed was to lose more bodily fluids. Modern historians think it was either mass psychogenic illness or ergot poisoning from contaminated grain. The latter would explain the uncontrollable movements and hallucinations, since ergot contains compounds similar to LSD. Though bad bread made everyone trip so hard they died dancing, sounds more like a cautionary tale about medieval bakeries than actual history. The dancing plague of 1518 wasn't even unique. Similar outbreaks happened across Europe during the medieval period, though none reached quite this scale. It's like humanity went through a phase where spontaneous deadly dance parties were just something you had to watch out for, along with regular plagues and random Viking raids. When people finally weren't dying from involuntary dance marathons, they turned to an equally bizarre solution for more mundane ailments. Because if you thought the dancing plague was weird, wait until you hear about medieval people's favorite cure for headaches: power tools. Trepanation, drilling holes in skulls to cure headaches, was so popular that some medieval patients came back for seconds, because apparently the first gaping head wound didn't provide enough ventilation. Medieval medicine had a refreshingly direct approach to brain surgery. When in doubt, add more holes. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ensisheim, France, shows skulls with multiple healed holes, meaning not only did people survive having their heads drilled open, they thought, you know what would make this better? Another hole. The procedure was surprisingly methodical for something that involved boring into someone's skull. Surgeons used specialized tools ranging from flint knives to bronze drills, carefully scraping away bone until they reached the dura mater, the protective membrane covering the brain. And they did this while the patient was usually conscious, because medieval anesthesia consisted mainly of, "Here, drink this wine," or "Bite this stick." If you were lucky, you might get some opium to take the edge off. If you weren't, well, at least the procedure was quick. The truly bizarre part? It worked. Sometimes, archaeological evidence shows survival rates around 50%, which sounds terrible until you remember this was an era when a paper cut could kill you. Many skulls show clear signs of healing, indicating people lived years or even decades after having holes drilled in their heads. The practice reached peak popularity during the Black Death because when faced with plague symptoms, voluntary brain surgery suddenly seemed like a reasonable option. Surgeons would drill holes to release evil vapors or excess pressure. Medieval medicine was big on letting things out of the body, whether those things needed to exit or not. Some patients were so satisfied with their new head ventilation that they came back for additional holes. Multiple skulls have been found with 3 or 4 healed trepanation sites, suggesting either remarkable surgical success or really persistent headaches. The most mind-bending part? Trepanation wasn't even considered particularly dangerous by medieval standards. In an era when basic surgery had mortality rates above 80%, drilling holes in skulls was practically routine healthcare. After all, when half the population was about to die horribly, survivors would discover that sometimes catastrophic mortality rates could have unexpected benefits, like accidentally creating the first labor shortage in recorded history. The Black Death killed 60% of Europe's population, but accidentally created the first labor shortage in recorded history. Suddenly, surviving peasants could demand actual wages instead of subsistence scraps. Nothing teaches basic economics quite like apocalyptic death rates. Before 1347, European peasants were essentially property, working land they'd never own for lords who saw them as walking farm equipment. Then the plague killed half the workforce, and suddenly those worthless peasants discovered they had something their lords desperately needed: a pulse. The shift was dramatic. The plague's economic impact rewrote the social contract. Peasants who'd never left their villages began traveling to find better opportunities. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Some lords tried offering signing bonuses and benefits packages, because apparently the 14th century invented corporate recruitment. But the real kicker? This massive redistribution of wealth and power happened completely by accident. The Black Death killed people so indiscriminately that it created the medieval equivalent of a worker's paradise, albeit one where everyone you knew had died horribly. Surviving peasants didn't organize unions or stage protests. They just became valuable by being alive. The authorities tried everything to maintain the old system. Some lords attempted to keep peasants bound to their land through legal action. Others hired literal goon squads to intimidate workers. A few desperate nobles even offered to pay people in advance, basically inventing the signing bonus out of sheer panic. Yet nothing could stop the economic reality. When half your workforce dies, you can't keep treating the survivors like they're expendable. Medieval England had accidentally stumbled into the first recorded labor shortage, and all it took was the deaths of millions. Of course, the Black Death wasn't done reshaping society. Typhus killed more soldiers than actual warfare throughout history, because apparently dying gloriously in battle was too mainstream for a disease spread by lice. Forget epic sword fights and heroic charges. Most soldiers throughout history died because they couldn't stop scratching. Typhus, spread by infected lice feces getting scratched into the skin, has probably killed more warriors than all weapons combined. Nothing says military dignity quite like being taken out by bug poop. The numbers are staggering. During Napoleon's 1812 Russian campaign, typhus killed 400,000 French troops, more than combat, freezing temperatures, and the disastrous retreat combined. The Grande Armée, arguably the finest military force in Europe, was decimated not by Russian bullets, but by microscopic parasites hitching rides in their uniforms. Archaeological evidence tells the grim story. Military camp excavations consistently show more graves from disease than battle wounds. Soldiers' letters home described the horror of watching comrades die not from honorable combat, but from a fever that turned their skin purple and their minds to mush. The disease was brutally efficient. Once infected, soldiers would experience headaches and high fever, followed by a spotted rash that gave typhus its nickname, camp fever. Within days, victims would become delirious, often babbling military secrets to enemy spies who didn't even need to show up. The disease was doing their job for them. Armies tried everything to combat it. World War II saw the first widespread use of DDT to kill lice, because apparently coating soldiers in toxic insecticide was preferable to losing them to typhus. The real irony? Military commanders spent centuries perfecting battle tactics while their greatest enemy was quietly hiding in their troops' underwear. Entire campaigns were decided not by strategy or valor, but by which army had better hygiene practices. But if you think dying from lice feces is undignified, wait until you hear what the Romans dealt with while building their empire. Because nothing says imperial majesty quite like building roads while bleeding from your eyeballs. The Antonine Plague turned Romans' skin black and made them vomit blood for months, yet somehow they still found time to build Hadrian's Wall and conquer most of Britain. Picture this. You're a Roman engineer in 165 CE, trying to supervise construction of a massive defensive wall while your colleagues are literally coughing up bloody foam. That was just another day at the office during the Antonine Plague, which killed around 5 million people, including Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself. The symptoms read like someone trying to win a contest for most horrifying disease. According to the physician Galen, victims would develop black pustules all over their bodies while bleeding from multiple orifices. They'd spend weeks coughing up bloody foam before either dying or surviving with permanent damage. Modern experts think it was either smallpox or measles, but whatever it was, it basically turned people into walking horror shows. Here's the truly bizarre part. Roman bureaucracy kept functioning through all of this. We have archaeological evidence of mass graves from this period right next to perfectly constructed roads and buildings. Imagine being so committed to your infrastructure projects that even bleeding from your eyes won't stop you from hitting your deadlines. The plague hit military camps particularly hard. Archaeological digs along Hadrian's Wall show evidence of entire barracks being converted into makeshift hospitals. Yet, construction continued. Supply lines kept running. Administrative records were still meticulously kept, even if they had to occasionally note Centurion Flavius unable to sign off due to currently vomiting blood. Roman cities became death traps, with contemporary accounts describing streets littered with corpses. The wealthy fled to their country villas, taking the plague with them because apparently virus particles didn't respect social class. Yet somehow the empire's essential services never completely collapsed. What makes this even more remarkable is that they had no idea what caused the disease. Their best medical minds thought it was caused by bad air or divine punishment. Their solution? Burning aromatic herbs and making offerings to Apollo. Spoiler alert, it didn't help. The plague eventually burned itself out after about 15 years, leaving behind a significantly reduced but surprisingly resilient population. The Romans basically shrugged it off and went back to empire building, though with some interesting innovations in public health infrastructure. Nothing motivates urban planning quite like watching your citizens die horribly in the streets. This might be the most Roman response to a pandemic ever. Keep the paperwork flowing, keep the construction on schedule, and if people start bleeding from their faces, just make a note of it in the official record and carry on. Roman engineering. apparently stronger than biological warfare. These diseases shaped everything from city planning to social hierarchies to religious beliefs. Medieval cathedrals have wide aisles because of plague processions. Labor unions exist because of Black Death wage negotiations, and we still quarantine ships because of centuries of floating death traps. Today we complain when our Wi-Fi buffers for 30 seconds. Though considering how people react to wearing masks during pandemics, maybe we haven't evolved as much as we'd like to think.